what role will oil play in a future economy, not just in the region, but around the world?
Thank you. Your Highness, Your Excellencies, first of all, allow me to start by just thanking the UAE government for hosting this lovely and wonderful, magnificent event. Really, it's my first time to be here, and what a great display, what a variety, what a wealth and richness of subjects. So congratulations to the UAE for this excellent setup. We are in the UAE, so it's only right to talk about oil. The UAE is a proud member of OPEC. We're proud to have such a member in OPEC, the United Arab Emirates, which has been able to balance that question, which you posed, if I may put it back to you, almost as a dichotomy. But in reality, I don't see why the two should be contradicting with each other. Oil-producing nations, whether they are OPEC members or other nations around the world, there are 100 countries around the world that produce oil today. It's not just the 12 members of OPEC or the 22 countries within the OPEC Plus alliance have been able to responsibly develop their resources in accordance with the Charter of the UN. Let me remind everyone that the 1992 Rio Summit Charter says very clearly, states have the right to develop and exploit their natural resources in line with the UN Charter and the principles of international law, to exploit these natural resources in their own, pursuant to their own environmental and developmental policies. So this is an inalienable right that is available to nations to exploit these resources for societal, economic development. But at the same time, that does not exist in a vacuum from environmental concerns. Again, there is no better place on this planet to showcase this than the UAE. The UAE has been successfully able to develop its oil production, its gas production, but at the same time, do it in a way that is environmentally friendly. We have ADNOC in Abu Dhabi, we have Masdar, all companies that are involved in making sure that the climate issues are dealt with and appropriately in line with the Paris Agreement, conventions and agreements and frameworks, but also at the same time catering for energy security and the way that the UAE is planning to invest to upgrade and upscale its production capacity. This is an example of how the two can be done and achieved successfully, striking that fine balance between making sure that the wealth and the rents and the revenues that come from the production of oil are used to the benefit of the nation and the development of the nation, but also to be used for the development of future fuels such as renewables and others. So I think it's important to be able to find that balance rather than to pose the issue as if there is a dichotomy between the two and the two are actually in contravention or contradiction with each other.
I think what we saw quite clearly coming out of COP28 here in Dubai was this call to transition away from fossil fuels. And only in the last 24 hours, Dr. Sultan Al Jaber also forming what he's called the Troika, which is a group of leaders coming together to ensure that that transition away is maintained through COPs to come. So in your view, Your Excellency, how do you expect that transition away from fossil fuels to look like? And what are the implications regionally?
Well, first of all, you mentioned COP28. I think it's important also, again, to congratulate the UAE for the global decarbonization charter that was achieved in COP28 in Dubai here, where 50 plus oil and gas companies, leaders from the world, many of whom actually national oil companies from OPEC member states, including the likes of ADNOC and Saudi Aramco, signed to this charter, which is a clear demonstration of the intentions, the plans, the forward-looking approaches to dealing with energy transitions. And I stress the word energy transitions because I always add an S to the end, because there is no single energy transition. We firmly believe and we always advocate for the right to every country having its own energy transition pathway in accordance with its own national circumstances. Therefore, going back to the charter, I mean, this charter clearly talks about reducing carbon emissions to net zero by 2050, ending routine flaring, reduction of methane emissions. So the industry is clearly playing a very active and proactive role, actually, in leading by example. The beauty of COP28, as you mentioned, is that everybody was included in this discussion. This is something very important. As we tackle future energy challenges, while oil, we believe, remains a cornerstone for economic development, for societal development, for progress that has been created by the presence of oil for the past 200 years. However, going forward, this approach has to be more based on inclusiveness, dialogue, and therefore this Troika example that you mentioned is a clear sign of continuity in the approach and moving from one COP to the other, making sure that the pledges are implemented in the right way as we move forward.
Total Energy CEO Patrick Pouyanné said peak oil demand will take longer than we think. So what timelines seem realistic for significantly reducing our dependence on oil in your view? And what does peak look like in terms of a timeline?
Well, I'm not going to profess to having a crystal ball, but let me put it the other way around and say, before peak oil demand, there was the episode 1, I call it episode 1, which was peak oil supply. You all recall peak oil supply. Now, where are those who were professing that peak oil supply would happen? We don't hear of that anymore. Now is the beginning of episode 2, peak oil demand. Now, let's answer that by looking at how oil is so available and abundant in our everyday aspects of our life. Whether you come on a plane, whether you drive a car, whether you sit here, our dressing, everything we have today is a derivative of oil. For us in OPEC, again, we take the approach that all forms of energy will be required. No single source of energy will be able to replace another, especially oil. Today, oil represents over 30% of the global energy mix. It's a significant portion, 30%. When you add gas to that, we're talking about close to 60%. And 60% of the global energy mix, oil and gas, will continue to be a major component of the energy pie or the energy mix that continues to grow in the future years out to 2045. To give you a glimpse about our long-term outlook, we see oil demand rising to 116 million barrels a day by 2045. And that requires significant investments in oil in the industry, investments in the order of $14 trillion. That's over $600 billion a year. And it's for two simple reasons. You cannot just unplug from the current energy system overnight. We have to deal with energy transitions with pragmatism, with realism, taking into account that 30% of this energy mix is massive. It is not simple to just replace overnight. Today, when we talk or we hear talk about peak oil demand, it's almost like a zero-sum game discussion, that one form of energy will simply replace the other overnight, or that renewables are here to compete with oil. We believe this is totally incorrect, it's misguided, and it's not constructive either, for two simple reasons. Number one, when we look at renewables today, as an example, I'm not picking on renewables, let's take solar panels, or let's take wind turbines, for example. Even the batteries, lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles, somehow, some way, some form, they are all linked in the end to the production of raw materials that come from oil derivatives, whether it's the calcined coke for the lithium-ion batteries in EVs, whether it's the plastics, the resins, the fibers, all the synthetic materials that go into solar panel construction or wind turbines. So they will actually complement each other. You cannot have all these materials that will be required for renewable energy without actually having the raw materials that come from the petroleum. That's number one. The second reason is the sheer growth in the size of the global economy, which is expected to double compared to what it is today by 2045, and the massive growth in global population, where we expect in our forecast that the global population will rise by almost 1.5 billion from now to 2045. And most of that growth will be in non-OECD developing parts of the world. Add to that another element which is very important, is the rate of rapid urbanization around the world. Our forecast shows that around 582 million people are expected to move into new cities all around the world from now to 2030. 2030 is only 6 years away from today. And let me add another number there just to put that number into real context. 582 million people by 2030. We are here in Dubai today. The population of Dubai is, give or take, 3.5 million barrels, not million barrels a day. I'm used to that term, so 3.5 million people. That's about 160 new Dubais around the world from now to 2030. Can you imagine the sheer size, the magnitude of the energy that will be required to fuel another 150 or 160 cities around the world? So it's not simple just to say we can say there's going to be peak oil tomorrow or in 5 or 10 years. I don't like to give a time horizon, to go back to your question, Dan, because nobody has a crystal ball. But I can say the discussion based on data, driven estimates, which we do in OPEC very well. Everybody has been complimenting our long-term outlook from independent sources, whether it's media as well. We don't go on the basis of ideological concepts to derive our numbers, as some others may do. We look at hard data, raw data. We do a bottoms-up approach analysis. We have global access to information in consuming countries, producing countries, and that's how we estimate our forecasts. And I think talking about peak oil demand is probably something way far out, to put it in as simple a way without committing myself to a timeline.
You know, I think it's just fascinating when you talk about the increase that we're going to see in global oil demand, specifically looking at a country like India, for example, and to use your point, it adds the equivalent of one Los Angeles every single year, just in terms of population growth in India. So India needs all of the energy it can get and all of the energy sources possible. But the problem that we see is that the political pressure on energy suppliers is ramping up. And I think it's become increasingly controversial to be a fossil fuel producer. So if the world needs all of this energy, how do you also incentivize investment into clean energy to ensure that it's politically palatable? And ultimately, how do we ensure that it benefits the environment as well?
Well, that's a great question. And talking about India, just briefly before I answer the question, I was in India last week. And to your point, we heard the Honorable Prime Minister Modi talking about how India's economy is going to become the third largest economy in the world. India has overtaken China in terms of population growth. The cities, the technologies, the investments that are happening in India are unprecedented. And to your point, that's going to require a lot more energy. And it's not all going to be oil. It's going to be all kinds of energy, everything they can get their hands on to help develop and sustain that development. Back to your point, I mean, for us in OPEC, we have a mission. Our mission has been, since the creation of OPEC in 1960, sustainable, stable flows of oil, energy to the world. We will continue with that mission. That's why our member countries, including the United Arab Emirates, continue to invest in oil production, continue to develop refining capacity, midstream, petrochemical, the whole value chain. It's an integrated value chain because we believe this is our mission and objective, to supply the world with all the energy it will require for future growth. We don't look out far 5 years ahead or 10 years ahead. We look much further out. We will continue to do this. As I mentioned, the numbers are staggering. $14 trillion of investments required in the oil industry alone from now to 2045. It is a challenge with some of the pressures that we face on how people look at the oil industry. But I think what has happened here in COP28, what will happen, inshallah, in COP29 and in COP30, is that all players are coming to the table. And this is a successful method to deal with these issues. The UAE has started and led by example by bringing everybody to the table here in Dubai, COP28, and we saw the results of that. Positive results where people are included in the discussion. So we always emphasize that when energy transitions occur, they have to be just, they have to be orderly, they have to be inclusive, and they should leave nobody behind. When we talk about transitioning and the pressures that you mentioned, rightly so, Dan, these pressures sometimes fail to take into account that we have over 650 million people around the world today without access to basic electricity. I have seen these people. I have been to some countries and I have seen these villages where people don't have access to switching on the light. They don't have access to taking a bike or a car to the nearest village. They have to walk 100 kilometers or so. People still using wood as cooking fuels in certain parts of the world. Over 2 billion people, that's almost a quarter of the population of this planet. So when we talk about not investing in in conventional sources of energy, hydrocarbons specifically. Also, part of the equation has to account for energy transition. We talk about energy security, we talk about energy affordability, energy availability, but nobody really touches on the word energy poverty. And that's another critical element of this discussion that must not be left behind.
We only have a couple of minutes left, so I'll ask you a few rapid-fire questions. This is a question that was asked to His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz in Saudi Arabia just yesterday. He was in conversation about the current state of the market, and I want your assessment of market balances right now. Do you see the current range that we're in as being a Goldilocks environment in terms of oil pricing? I know you don't talk about pricing, but where do we stand in the market right now with regards to balances?
Well, we're going to issue our monthly oil market report today, later on the day, so it will have a very clear answer to your question, Dan. But for the benefit of the audience, again, yes, you rightly mentioned, we don't talk about prices, we don't forecast prices. We see demand rising by over 2 million barrels a day for this year, year-on-year growth versus last year, healthy. We are seeing positive signs of good revisions to some parts of the global economy, most notably the United States, where GDP has been revised upwards. We're seeing a lot of bullish statements, even from some of the speakers we heard yesterday here talking about the US economy. China is, although there are question marks about China, we still feel very robust about China, and we are seeing the Chinese government stepping in to take corrective measures. All of this with the fact of the phenomenal economic growth we're seeing in India. All of this, I think, leads us to believe that we will have a strong economy this year with positive implications for oil demand. Non-OPEC supply, US and others, we're seeing good production coming out of Guyana, out of Brazil, Canada, maybe a potential slowdown in the United States from the shale patches, yet to be seen because it's resilient and we keep seeing a surprise in shale production year on year. So overall, we feel that the market is in a good state right now, rather stable, but we cannot predict. That's why we in OPEC Plus with our partners, we continue to be very preemptive, proactive, and our joint monitoring ministerial committee meets every 2 months, and we reevaluate the market conditions. We cannot really tell from now what's going to happen, but I think we will keep doing what we do best, which is being proactive and united as a group, and making sure that the market remains healthy and stable.
And OPEC is a pretty exclusive club, but it is getting bigger. What can you tell me about Brazil's membership? Do you have an update for us?
Well, exclusive not actually. We are open to any oil producer that has a common interest, which is the stability of the market, to join. Brazil has joined what we have signed in 2019, which is called the Charter of Cooperation. It's a platform that encourages more dialogue, broader, comprehensive dialogue between oil-producing nations around the world. Of course, Brazil is a significant player with phenomenal growth in production over the past years. They are in the BRICS, of course, and they are a member. They are the head of the G20 this year, and will be hosting COP30 next year. So it's important for us that Brazil has made this step and come closer. And we believe there are other countries that are also interested to come closer to cooperating with OPEC and OPEC Plus in this wider framework for preserving oil market stability.